The, so today I want to talk about healing the gut. And there's going to be a more specific topic really about intestinal permeability. And it's an interesting topic because it is so prevalent. There's so many people who are affected by it, and many, many people who are affected by it have no idea they're affected by it because it affects them in ways that aren't related to their intestine. You know, and one of the worst things about intestinal permeability is that because its symptoms don't manifest in the gut, they can manifest in a dozen different places in the body, typically. And oftentimes, if you go looking for help, you'll find somebody, especially if you go to a physician who's specializing in looking at symptoms, they'll send you away with a prescription to relieve your symptom. But because what I'm just saying now, the symptoms aren't where the problem started, and the symptoms won't be relieved, or won't relieve the condition, so there's no real chance of getting closer to healing. And it's so prevalent, and it's almost like a perfect condition for the modern approach to medicine not to work. So it's great because it makes room for chiropractors and naturopaths, and it makes room for all of us who are helping people take control of their own health and start to rebuild their systems and get more vitality. And so that's all very, very good for us. The National Institute of Health, the National Institute of Health says that there are about 70 million people in the United States who have digestive diseases. 70 million, it's 1 out of 5 Americans. And it's an astonishing number when you get right down to it. But I was thinking, most of the people I know occasionally might have indigestion or bloating. They might have heartburn, they might have constipation. Some folks get diarrhea occasionally, some folks have gas, But they would never say, well, I've got a disease. So what about them? These are the people who've probably never been to a doctor who gave them a diagnosis. And quite frankly, so many people can't qualify for a diagnosis. It's symptoms and signs and usually tests and the collaboration of all those factors that lead to a diagnosis or at least an initial clinical impression. And without having that in place, you don't really have a disease. So there are all these people who are pre-disease, who are going to the store and trying to get some sort of relief. I was wondering what size that group was, so I actually called somebody at the Payless drugstore up in the Cully neighborhood. And I chose the Cully neighborhood because it's the hub of a number of different neighborhoods that are very different economically, different education-wise, different culturally. And I just wanted to see, with all these people coming together at the same place, what are they looking for? And when you go to a Payless, the staff knows, don't give anybody any advice. If somebody really wants advice, send them to the pharmacist, because they're worried about liability. People who have diseases, get prescriptions, and 2 out of 5 prescriptions written in America are for relief of digestive distress. 2 out of 5. With all these other people who are buying over-the-counter medications, how common is it? I'm sure it's common, but I didn't know. So I talked to this pharmacist and had a great conversation. This was a young guy, only in practice for a couple of years at the Cully Rite Aid. His name was Nitin Mandina. And it was so great to hear a pharmacist say, people shouldn't start out with over-the-counter meds. They should be looking at their nutrition, looking at their lifestyle, they should be looking at their exercise. And it's like, this guy's a pharmacist. He's talking like a naturopath. He's talking like a chiropractor. What's going on here? The world is changing. It's like, thank God. That's wonderful. And I asked him, when I told him what I was doing, I told him what I was going to be talking about today, and he was totally into it. And I told him I was a chiropractor, so I was coming from an alternative perspective, and he was totally into that. So it was really great. And when I asked him about what do people ask for when they come in, and I'm wondering how often is it digestive, problems, digestive discomfort. And he said 40 to 60% of the people who ask him for advice are looking for relief of digestive distress. Is that astonishing? So we have 70 million people with diagnosed diseases. We have 40 to 60% of the folks coming in for just over-the-counter help, looking for relief of digestive diseases. It's like, it's clear that we have a problem. It's a big problem. So there's a second thing I wanted to look at today, and so there's a different stat, and these things might seem, at first, well, to some of us, totally unrelated, and to others, they probably see already how these things tie in. But this is autoimmune diseases. And the last year and a half, since doTERRA really, I've been like throwing myself into a deep, deep study of basically everything I knew in the past as a physician, and I want to update it and relearn it and see what's changed and what we know. And one of the most shocking things was studying autoimmune disease. And in listening to some of the leading researchers in autoimmunity in the world, they are saying that the alarms are ringing, basically, and that autoimmunity is just going through the ceiling. They're saying that 65 to 70 million people in America have autoimmune conditions right now. And that rang a bell with me. There was a dissonance, because I knew from things I'd heard in the past that the actual number of people that are reported don't have anywhere, it's not anywhere near that great. The NIH says it's about 24, 25 million. But in reality, when I looked into it to figure out why that is, the National Institute of Health only tracks 26 autoimmune conditions. And when you talk to these researchers, they say that there are almost 200 identified autoimmune conditions now. But the very interesting thing is, anymore, autoimmunity is thought to have 3 common factors regardless of what the autoimmune condition is. And one is that it has to have a genetic factor. So basically, the genetic factor does not predispose you to have something as though you have a sentence to having a condition. That's not at all true. What is true is that all of us have certain vulnerabilities in our genetic code, certain things that are areas that if we don't make good choices, if something's going to go wrong, there are certain areas that will be higher risk to go wrong than others. And that's the extent of the genetic impact. The second leg of this 3-legged stool is the leg that refers to toxins. And toxins will be environmental toxins, and there's thousands and thousands and thousands of them, unfortunately. And then also the toxins we find in our food, whether they be the preservatives, whether they be just toxins from poor preparation, or whether they be the additives that are damaging our food. And I won't even bring up genetically modified food, because that's a whole intestinal permeability disaster in itself. The third factor of autoimmunity is that it requires intestinal permeability. And this to me was a surprising statement, because here's one condition that seems to now be the foundation of what autoimmune scholars are saying, upwards of 200 conditions. But the essential foundation is the intestinal permeability. So we wanted to take a look at that. The simplest definition of intestinal permeability I could come up with is that it's the breakdown of our intestinal lining by chronic inflammation over a prolonged period of time. So basically, we're having things come into our system that irritate our system, that inflame our system, and they're part of our regular routine, so our body sees it again and again. So the main focus of what I'm going to be looking at now is intestinal permeability, and we'll see now how it is the foundation for autoimmune conditions as well. There are actually many different factors that can cause intestinal permeability. One factor can be pathogens. One factor can be different bacteria that secrete toxins. There can be external toxins that very quickly do. I mentioned the genetically modified foods that I really won't mention again. I don't think. But the one by far and away that causes the most trouble, the one that we see the most often, and the one that's most common in our culture is wheat. Okay, so today we're going to be looking at wheat as an example of intestinal permeability because it is so frequently the cause that we might as well just use it as the model for how to create intestinal permeability in our small intestine. Okay. Wheat is a very emotional issue for a lot of people. It's a part of our culture. It's manna, it's bread from heaven, it's the staff of life. It's, for Christians, it's the Eucharist. It's very, very personal. And the Romans built an entire empire that was built on the idea of bread and circuses. Yeah, they liked to keep people entertained, but they also gave people things that they hadn't seen before. They gave people a way to cultivate crops in a way they didn't really know how to do. And they could do it successfully with grain. And they could have a crop that would then be something they could store. And in storing the crop, they would be safe through the winter with food, and they would be able to survive, hopefully, in a famine. So the idea of bread and circuses was a great boon to a lot of the people in a very decentralized Europe at that time. You know, they weren't conquering huge armies oftentimes. They were just going into areas where nobody was in control. Everybody was just kind of doing their own thing, and it was fairly chaotic and very primitive. So the original wheat was called emmer wheat, and it had about 14 chromosomes. It was a low, scraggly grass, and it didn't produce much seed. You know, but the wheat that we've evolved, that we know today, is nothing like that. This is a product of years of experimentation, years of hybridization, years of creating wheat plants that weren't satisfactory enough to various people. They wanted different refinements. And what ultimately came about is a wheat that is the hybrid of 3 different types of wheat, 3 different genuses of wheat. And the goal was to create a wheat that would be a shorter wheat. Some wheat could be 4.5 feet tall, and it was really a pain in the neck to deal with, because all you really want is the seed up on the top, but you've got all of this chaff as well. So they wanted a shorter plant. They wanted a short that was stout enough so that it could endure strong winds. But then they also wanted a plant that would produce a tremendous amount of seed, because that was the grain that they were going to turn to food. So if you're a farmer, you want the highest productivity from your field. You want the highest yield. And what they evolved was what's now called a modern semi-dwarf wheat. But from combining all these, there's one thing I want to mention is that there's an interesting thing that happens in the hybridization of wheat. You know, you kind of think of hybridization as taking a few genes from here, taking a few genes from here, mixing them all together, and we come up with something that maybe we like it, maybe we don't. If we like it, we go with it. If we don't like it, we throw it away and start again, back to the drawing board. Wheat is different, and it's not the only plant like this. Many plants are like this. When they're hybridized, they don't take a few genes. They take all of the genes, the entire genetic complement of the other plant, and they just combine them. So now we have the complement of 3 entire different plants that I don't think ever would occur in nature, but through the marvels of our desire, we have created something that would not exist in nature otherwise. And that's part of the complexity of what happens and where the problems actually come from. Industry wanted a bread that was puffy and light. They wanted a bread that, one benefit of that is a puffy light bread creates a big loaf and then keeps on growing and creates another big loaf, where if you use a whole wheat grain, it doesn't rise anywhere near as much, and the same amount of flour makes a single loaf. So you can get a whole lot more money by selling a whole lot more bread filled with air than if you try to sell a whole grain. And everybody's seen Franz bread, everybody's seen Wonder Bread, everybody's heard that it grows your body in 12 ways. Unfortunately, most of them are towards illness. So in the past 50 years, the amount of gluten in wheat has doubled. We hear a great deal about wheat, but I want to just explain for a minute, not from a food perspective, but from a botanist's position, what is gluten? Okay? Gluten is actually in the seed of every seed-bearing grass. And it has a very specific role within the seed. It's the food that the seed consumes when the seed exists, but before it's been planted and the plant is germinated, so it's grown a root. Once it has a root, it can draw from the soil. It can get its moisture, it can get its nutrition. Until that point, it consumes gluten. So that's why the gluten needed to be there, and it's essential to any plant that has it in its seed. So it's important from that perspective. It just doesn't work well for us. But because it is present in every grain, it's important to know that some glutens are bad in the sense of what we're going to be talking about, and some not so. Now, having said that question, and talking with Josie the other day, she was pointing out that it's a totally loaded statement because there are other things that go on with grains. There are other problems with grains. There are individual allergies to individual grains besides what we're talking about with gluten right now. And it may not be the gluten of these other grains that is the problem that you're having from corn or from another plant if you have a problem with rice or something like that. So it's interesting to just separate that for the purpose of this discussion right now, that this mechanism that creates intestinal permeability is basically brought about by the gluten that's found in wheat, barley, and rye. Some folks include oats in that group, but the reason they include oats in that group is because there's research that shows that there's frequently cross-contamination in the processing of oats. You can have a shipment of oats going to a place that only deals oats, driven there by a truck that last week was harvesting nothing but wheat. And they didn't clean out the truck. So the oats get to the processing mill, they're processed, and the gluten from the wheat is in the oats. When the oat was growing in the ground, it had no gluten of this type. Okay, so it ought to be safe, you don't know. There's actually a published study that I saw that was looking at oats that came from a place that only processed oats, that was all they did, that had an unacceptably high level of wheat gluten in it. And the worst of all, by the way, just so you know, Quaker Oats, 1,800 parts per million, and the limit of acceptability for gluten is 20 parts per million. So they just missed at 1,800. Yeah, poor Quaker. So to describe the problem with wheat, with gluten, we need to take a look at proteins. And proteins are, oh, excuse me for a second. That's exactly what we need to be. Yeah. Proteins are chains of amino acids. And amino acids are very specific. They're the building blocks of all the protein structures in our body. So when we eat protein, the protein has to be broken down into individual amino acids so that it can be absorbed through the intestinal wall. But there's a problem with this gluten from this specialized wheat that's never existed before. And the problem is that there are sequences of amino acids that have never appeared anywhere in nature in this wheat. And consequently, the human body has never had enzymes that could break this wheat down. So when we have it in our system, there's no way that we can break it down. It's not a question that some people can break it down and some people can't break it down. Nobody can break this wheat down. It's just a question of how badly the body responds to the gluten in wheat. But the important factor, the takeaway from that is that no human being can digest the gluten in wheat. Okay. Yeah. I really wanted to say that only because we hear so many different things today about gluten. So many different things, so many contradictory things, so many things that would leave you in a state of constant confusion. And from my perspective, I've just been diving into the research for like 18 months now, and it's an amazingly active field of research and study, and the publications are flying out of the problems that are there from this, and nobody is saying maybe it is, maybe it's not a problem. Everybody is saying it's a problem. It's just how extensive is the problem's reach? How much damage does it cause? So because we can't digest the wheat, what happens is the wheat breaks down into fragments called gliadins. And the gliadins are like the pearls in a broken necklace. So the most common one has 33 amino acids that cannot be broken down. 17 is another, 12 another, 11 another. There are actually 60 different fragments called gliadin in the gliadin family that have been identified as having having produced autoimmune responses in the body. So you see how extensive it is, how big it is. Now here's a problem too. If you went to an allergist would only look for one aspect of the response to gliadin, and that would be an IgE response, the allergic response, the classic. And when you test for that, 7 out of 10 people will test negative when they're positive. And if you only test for IgE, you'll never know all the other things that are going on, because outside of IgE to this one gliadin, there are a whole host of other responses that can happen that are really where most of the problems lie. They're not showing up in the test, and that's why your doctor tells you it's in your head and go away. So the actual mechanism is that when the gliadin presses into the system, the gliadin initiates a full-on immune response. An immune response is actually the body actually working properly. So when a fragment comes into the system, there's a full-on immune response. An immune response damages the intestinal wall. An immune response causes massive inflammation, and that is the beginning of a process that can only get worse from there. I'll explain it more in a moment, but I just want to say that that's what happens every time a single fragment of gliadin presses against the intestinal wall. But if you think about it, let's just think, I mean, a lot of us here probably have a more conscious diet, hopefully, but the conscious diet of America is a different diet. I went through the new Fred Meyer's on 20th and Burnside in Northwest the other day, and I realized I felt like a stranger in a strange land. There's so few aisles I can shop on anymore. You know what I mean? I'm pretty much reduced to the new corner where the produce is. But these other aisles are not for me. And so many things that would be so much better if people weren't eating. But that's the standard American pattern right now. That's what they eat. It's why they sell it. So imagine, say at work one day this week, you had beautiful French toast for breakfast. And that French toast was incredible. Okay. There's beautiful French toast now. So this beautiful French toast is going to cause thousands of gliadin fragments. And they're all coming at once. You know, you ate your breakfast, it's all coming through your intestine, it's all partially breaking down. You know, fats are breaking down, carbs are breaking down, proteins are breaking down and not breaking down. And when they're all pressing at the same time at thousands of different places in the intestine. So this little mechanism that causes massive inflammation is happening thousands of times throughout your small intestine and causing a massive inflammatory response. And that's the basic initiation. But then what happens is that your body can survive that. Your body's tough. You know, the intestinal wall will replace itself every 3 to 5 days. But when you went to work, one of your workers brought some voodoo donuts, and they looked so good. You had to have one. Well, you had two. You know, and so there's another fire that's going on in the system now. And you know, that way, again, the body is resistant. It can go through these things. But then as you're going on through your day, you go to lunch. And at lunch, you go down to the corner deli, and you get a sub sandwich. And you have that you have half the sandwich. And that's okay, but then at 4 o'clock, you're feeling a little bit fatigued, so you go get some coffee, and then you finish the sandwich with your coffee. So again, you know, we have another dose of gliadin coming into your system. Then after work, it's been a long day, you're feeling a little bit tired, you don't want to cook, you go out to the old spaghetti factory with a friend, and you've had, you know, oh my. Yeah. So although you had the salad, it had those great garlicky croutons, the crunchy ones, and then you only had a small, like a half plate of the delicious spaghetti with brown butter and the zithra cheese. And oh boy. So you can see, oh, there may be a problem here. But basically, when you think about it, the intestine is a continual tube that goes through our mouth all the way through our body down to the other end. And if something doesn't go through the wall into the system, it never really enters the interior of our body. So being in our intestine, it's still technically outside the body until it's absorbed. Now the lining of the intestine, or actually the wall of the intestine, is what Josie gave this great slide of. And the surface of the intestinal wall is made of these finger-like structures called villi. And then, if you look at the third photograph, it's a microscopic image. On those villi, there are billions of microvilli. And what this does is it creates an enormous amount of surface area in a small amount of space, so that there can be the optimal ability for the intestine to absorb the nutrients that are passing through the intestine as your food is passing through. But imagine what happens to those delicate structures when thousands of particles are coming in and starting an inferno, evidently. And not just doing it once, but doing it many times a day, which is kind of our standard diet. So what happens is that the massive inflammation starts to cause damage to those villi, starts to inflame the wall. When the wall is inflamed, we can't absorb our nutrients anymore. So you can't absorb calcium, so all of a sudden you may start showing signs of osteoporosis. You know, you can't absorb your iron. Iron is only absorbed in the first 1.5 feet or so of the intestine. It's inflamed, you're not getting your iron, you may start to show signs of anemia. So just on that level of inflammation alone, you can be having problems. But now, these villi are covered with a single cell, the epithelium, and think of it like a cheesecloth. Okay, the cheesecloth is just like in your grandma's kitchen. A piece of cheesecloth would be the thing that she would strain her gravy through so the lumps didn't come through. It just allows the small particles through. And the intestine wants to absorb amino acids one at a time, maybe two at a time. More than that, it starts to struggle. But when we present a gliadin fragment that's 33 amino acids long, it comes up to the wall and actually tears its way right through. And this, of course, is damaging to the gut wall. Inside the gut wall, when gliadin is present, what happens is that there's a hormone that's only been really known for about 9 years now, zonulin. And zonulin has a special purpose. And this is what we need to. Here's another image of the gut wall. And in this diagram, you'll see what's called a tight junction. Those are 3 epithelial cells. They're really the cells of the cheesecloth that the gliadin is pressing into right now. And what you'll see in the brown arrow on your right is that, well, the one on the right, the one on the left I don't want you to, the one on the left is exactly what happens from Monsanto's, yeah, we don't want to talk about that right now. That's a whole different nasty lecture. Don't get me started on that one. Yeah. But anyway, when you look at the one on your right, then what you'll see is gliadin pressing into the space between the cells. Zonulin is secreted, and it does something that might sound counterintuitive. It unlocks the tight junction between the cells, which is kind of the gate that keeps things out. I mean, why would it do this to a fragment that is so alien to it? And I think, it doesn't come with instructions, so it never really describes, but I think we can have a case of at least saying the body doesn't want to resist things it doesn't understand. The body wants to experience things it doesn't understand. The body wants to learn those things. The body wants to experience them and learn how to deal with them so it'll know how to handle them whenever it sees it. So it allows that in, and initially there's a massive attack. The attack wants to learn this cell, wants to see how it can be disabled, and wants to escort it out of the body. That's the nature of the response. So this is a fairly simplified model of the immune system. Actually, it's very much like this. And maybe. So anyway, memory B cells are powerful white blood cells, specialized cells that have the role of figuring what something is and memorizing it. It has the role then of knowing what happens and knowing what to do when something comes into the body. So it's in charge, it's the general. And our Bettys up here are the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, and the Marines. In reality, they're immunoglobulins, and they each have different capabilities, different functions, and they can each attack something in a different way. So maybe the second Betty is an IgE, and if you have that type of reaction, you can test for it, and a doctor will tell you have an allergy. Maybe there's an is it an IgA that shows up in scratch tests? Is that the one, Josie? Yeah, I think it's an IgA that shows up in scratch tests, but it may not be. It may not be positive. But there are other Bettys. There are lots of other Bettys that the body can use to attack gliadin as the general is figuring out what's the mix of what works to normalize something that's inflammatory in our body. One of the things that these Bettys do is that they will secrete cytokines to attack the substance. And now this is one of the problems because cytokines are tremendous irritants, they're tremendously inflammatory. And once they're secreted, most of them stay active for 60 to 90 days. Some have actually been shown to be active for 180 days, 6 months. Now here's the thing, cytokines, once secreted, aren't limited to just being in the area they're being attacked. They're not limited to just attacking that single object, that single fragment of gliadin. They can enter the bloodstream. And when they do, they can circulate anywhere in the body. And we were mentioning before the idea that our genetic code doesn't predispose us to a disease. It basically just says you have a vulnerability here. So much of what happens is up to you and the decisions you make. Okay, but here we have a situation where we've allowed massive amounts of cytokines, highly inflammatory particles, to enter our system, and they tend to precipitate out into those vulnerable points in our system. So where will they go? For me, it might be different than what it might be for you. For every one of us in the room, we might have our own unique mix of where these things might go. So you may have a response anywhere from 3 to 14 days after you had a grilled cheese sandwich. And it may be in your joints. It may be you're just feeling mentally foggy. It may be in your liver. You probably wouldn't know about that. It may be in your intestine, possibly. It could be in just about any organ of your body, depending on your genetic expression and where those vulnerabilities are. But wherever it concentrates, you'll start to have inflammatory processes that are going on in your body at that time, in that place. And they tend to be habitual, so that you tend to have those places develop at places where your inflammation happens. So your response to gluten might be something that you would never put your finger on knowing, either because it was 3 to 14 days and manifesting after you ate the gluten, or because you have no way of relating it to an intestinal condition. Can you see why this is tough for doctors too? You know what I mean? It's not easy. I will get down on people who just like chase symptoms and look for a way to eliminate a symptom and then say you're good enough, because it always misses something, but you can look at somebody who was really earnest and still they might have problems figuring out what's wrong with you, seeing that they're coming from the outside and you're not talking about gluten. You know what I mean? Gluten might be something that's really understood late in the game rather than as a first part of your clinical evaluation. So anyway, what I've been describing here, this gliadin, this is the condition that now is called, in short, gluten sensitivity, but it has technically a longer name. If you ever see this anywhere, it'll probably show up as non-celiac gluten sensitivity. And the reason it's discussed that way is because in the medical profession, there's been this idea that gluten is a problem of people with celiac disease. Celiac disease happens in 1% of the population. 99% of the population should just eat as much wheat as they want. That's the whole story. And there are 2 genes that need to be active in celiac disease. So they look for those 2 genes. If those 2 genes are there, then this is going to be celiac disease, but they can't call it celiac disease until all of those villi, the ones that we saw on those images before and in my little diagram that showed the gateways breaking down, all of those villi have to be completely leveled, destroyed, back to a flat wall. Then you can have celiac disease. It's funny, the staging of celiac disease was developed 30 years ago, maybe even 40 years ago, by a doctor named Marsh from Great Britain. And I was listening to an interview of him recently, and he was like completely frustrated. You know, for his whole career, he's been saying we have all these stages of celiac disease. They're all celiac disease. The medical profession says, no, only the final stage is the disease. And the medical profession has spread that. They've told their patients that, they send people away. So what's evolved in that huge gap of most people who have the condition existing without getting proper medical advice, even though they've tried to get proper medical advice, is a term called silent celiac. And silent celiac is basically people who have those genes and people who show all the markers of gluten sensitivity, but are in the process of experiencing the destruction of their villi, but it's not yet complete. And the sad thing is, when you go to a medical doctor, they'll tell you that there is no real treatment. When you get to the last stage, they'll tell you that there is no cure and you'll probably die of it. It's that serious. But in all these earlier stages, and even in that stage, with changes in your diet, you can actually turn that negative process around and start to build recovery. In the earlier stages, you can actually recover pretty much completely. So there's only a small fraction that we can call celiac or silent celiac. So we have this other term, non-celiac gluten sensitivity. And that group is thought to be 30 or more times larger than the celiac group. And that doesn't even include the entire population, which is still creating inflammation when they have gluten. Okay, so it gets complex. But the best study ever done just came out 5 months ago. It was in Italy. And they followed 5,000 patients who had gluten sensitivity, non-celiac gluten sensitivity. And these are the results up here. Look at the symptoms. 69% reported a lack of well-being, 64% fatigue, 54% headache, 39% anxiety, 38% brain fog, 32% numbness in the fingers and toes, muscle pain, skin rash, weight loss, anemia still, 23%, depression, dermatitis, rhinitis, or asthma. Now, here's the most interesting thing about that list to me, as distressing as it is. Look at that list and tell me, where are gastric problems? They're not even on the list. And the truth of the matter is, only one of eight people have symptoms of the gut problem when they have this gut problem. It manifests in all these other places instead. And this study was great because this is the first enormous and persuasive study that's come out on gluten sensitivity, and it was written by a man named Umberto Volta, who actually created 30 some odd years ago the tests for gluten allergy, and now is the leading voice in gluten sensitivity, basically saying, my own tests don't work. So he's at the forefront of what this is. There's no real conflict on that level. So wherever our individual system is vulnerable, cytokines circulating in the blood will accumulate and cause the focus of inflammation. We've already gone over that. In specific genetic expressions, the focus of inflammation can actually go further than just inflaming and causing like degeneration of tissues. It can actually go further through a special mechanism and create an autoimmune disease. But it happens, the mechanism I'm going to talk about is called molecular mimicry. And for that, we have to go back to the fragment of pearls in that broken pearl strand. And what happened in that broken pearl strand is we had all of the amino acids that the body had not seen or could not digest. But let's just say, if we looked at those pearls, we could name each one of those pearls with a different amino acid name. But for the sake of example, let's just say the fragment was A, B, C, D, E. So we had a general, and that general has memorized A, B, C, D, E. He has his Army, Navy, Marines, and Air Force ready to go to attack it in just the way that works. And when he sees it, it's going to be full on. The immune system doesn't have a modest up switch. It's not on a rheostat. There's usually a baseline response, which is massive. And it can upregulate from the baseline, but it's very, very inefficient at down-regulating. So you get the baseline. You don't get a little bit of this and a little bit of that. You get the baseline. And that's the reason that inflammation can be so much more than we need sometimes, because we get the baseline. Okay? But now here's the thing. A, B, C, D, and E is what the general knows. The general doesn't live in the gut usually. The general is in the circulatory system going through our entire body. And let's say he's cruising through the body. He's just laying back because he doesn't have any gliadin to deal with. He's just kind of having some downtime. And he's passing through the thyroid gland. And as he's looking at the walls that he's passing through, and the walls are made of long, long strands of amino acids, what he finds is that there on the wall he can see an A, B, C, D, E in a strand of thyroid tissue. And he said, that is so devious. That's the thing I'm here for. So what does he do? He calls out the Bettys. You know, they're all out and they're all going full on with everything they can do to attack and neutralize that A, B, C, D, E fabric they just found in your thyroid gland. And then there's damage to the cells immediately, of course, and then other antibodies that are always in our system and need to be in our system come out to clean up the thyroid tissues that are damaged. And the thing is, thyroid tissues always get damaged. Every cell system in the body always gets damaged. So cells have to be cleaned up and taken away. And so we have antibodies ready to go and do the janitorial work of maintenance in our body. So those cells are coming up and taking these thyroid cells and learning about these thyroid cells that are clearly now not right for us, some reason. They used to be thyroid, but now they're getting a general awareness of other. And imagine again, because there's so many exposures to gliadin, so many of these generals are circulating, and these generals start to recognize A, B, C, D, E, and start to attack it. And this is a very simple example, but this is how Hashimoto's disease starts. This is the beginning of a thyroid autoimmune condition. And you can basically, from what the current research is saying, you can there are always going to be specifics. There are always going to be specifics and technicalities and things like this, but the basic example is this. Molecular mimicry can happen in any tissue in your body. And it seems to happen in ones where you seem to have a genetic vulnerability. And so there's a focus that starts there. The immune system learns a whole new level of attack that's not quite about the gliadin anymore, and gradually it comes to the point where standing on its own, when it recognizes your own thyroid gland, it'll attack it. Whether gliadin is there or not, it learned. And it's a sad learning. And the great news is that what we found is that Hashimoto's disease is also very responsive to changes in lifestyle, changes in diet. As we change what we're eating, as we put out the fire, we can actually allow the body to have the room to restore healthy tissue and to recover from that autoimmune condition. So this is a wonderful new area of basically recovering autoimmunity. Because as I said before, usually when you have an autoimmune condition, you said there's nothing we can do for it. All we can do is try to suppress your immune system. And this is actually what the medications are. They're immunosuppressive therapies and then pain relief as you continue in your degradation. But now here's the other interesting thing that should have tipped people off a long time ago, and that is that when somebody dies of an autoimmune disease, on average, they also have 7 other autoimmune diseases. So it's a little distressing that that's the state of the art, But I think we're learning more, and this new research can give you an idea. Something else too, because we have blood tests that can look at the Bettys and identify when they're present in your blood, there's a new field called predictive autoimmunology that's being researched most heavily in Israel. And they're doing some wonderful things where they're able to look at the antibodies in your blood and tell you decades before you have an autoimmune condition or before you have any symptoms of an autoimmune condition, that you have antibodies building in your body to attack these tissues. I was talking to somebody the other day who had that testing done, and they wound up having 3 different markers already present in their blood for multiple sclerosis. And it's like, who would want to deal with that? And how, if you had that in your future, would you not want to have information about it 10 to 20 years before it ever manifested? And if that was the case, would it be a motivator to change what you're eating? Yeah, of course, yeah. So maybe you'll pass on the Happy Meal. Maybe you'll pass on the pizza. Maybe you'll pass on those things that set the fire on fire. And yeah. So what it comes down to is we've created a lifestyle that put our house on fire. The house is burning. And, we can't go down the aisle at Rite Aid and throw some Tums at this thing. We can't go down and get some Prilosec for this thing. It's a moment of relief if it even gives relief, but the fire is burning and the fire needs to be put out. It'll save our lives. Yeah. So how do we deal with that? We have to, the first thing is put out the fire. The second thing is we have to start, we look at this body. The body is probably fairly depleted at this point, Not having good absorption because of all the inflammation in your gut. You wind up being able to not get the nutrients you need for proper function. So if we're giving good whole nutrition, then the body starts to build up. And then there are certain nutrients, certain things we can take that will help us to calm inflammation. And one of the things that's been, spacing on the word. What is the first thing for the breast that it's saying on the first? Oh yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, I spaced on the word, but colostrum is the first material that comes out of the breast when a mom is about to breastfeed. And that's incredibly rich in protective and healing and anti-inflammatory polypeptides. And those are being used now in healing the gut. They're very powerful in helping to heal intestinal permeability. But that's one of the things that should be on the list, but can be a big help. But then again, there are issues about dairy if you're considering using that. So another thing that's essential in our treatment of somebody like this, and this is something I wish I could have spent a whole session on, is talking about everything we're learning about the biome, the bacteria in our gut. And there are bacteria in our gut who have one explicit purpose of calming down inflammation. And there's this wonderful cohabitation that goes on with our biome that is essential to our health and well-being. You have these bugs by the billions living inside your system that basically live completely devoted to keeping you healthy, which is a very interesting thing. But when we take an antibiotic, we cause havoc in that community. When we take a non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drug like Tylenol or acetaminophen, things like this, it wreaks havoc in the biome. Antidepressant medications wreak havoc in the biome. It's a very strange thing. Right now, medical research has an amazing focus on the biome, and almost every major pharmaceutical treatment damages the biome. So there's an ironic little showdown that must be coming in the future. It's going to be interesting to see how that one is massaged into some sort of coherence. But it may be the best thing that ever happened to the medical community, because it's going to set them on track to start looking at more foundational treatments that really get to the cause of a problem. So here's the thing. I've briefly described the things that somebody can do to start taking control of their health. But what I was describing, gluten, is just one aspect of this condition. And the condition can be caused by many other factors, and all of these things are happening at the same time in the gut. It doesn't happen one example at a time, as I can describe it. So we have the bacteria, we might have parasites, we might have the secretory molecules that cause inflammation and permeate the gut themselves. All these different things that are already in most of our intestines are multiple factors that can also be affecting our gut. Oftentimes when somebody deletes gluten, wheat, and really there's a case for deleting all carbohydrates from your diet, it would not be a bad idea. And Josie was saying the other day, don't forget dairy, don't forget dairy. Dairy is also one of the leading causes of inflammation in the gut. So because of that, it can be very complex. Plus restoring the gut can be a very long-term proposition. You may start to feel better in just 2 or 3 weeks, but actually healing the gut can take a long, long time, and it oftentimes is helped if you have supervision. Now, here's the thing. Most people have gone to medical doctors and got no supervision. Oftentimes they got misinformation, got sent away. So the important thing is to find somebody who understands these conditions from a functional point of view and can handle them and help you in your process of allowing your body to heal and rebuild itself. And for that reason, we wanted to mention, because we have somebody in our doTERRA community who is trained in those areas, up to date in those areas, and also uses the oils. And that is that is our naturopath, Louise Rose, who's sitting somewhere. But there she is standing. She sits, she stands, she's a naturopath. And I was talking to her at break earlier, and she was saying that she does have room for new patients now. So if anybody wanted to look into this, that would be great. There's one thing I wanted to mention too. Standard testing won't work for this type of condition. You know, standard testing doesn't give you the information you need. There are specialized tests that are in existence now and are very, very accurate compared to what was available before. And Cyrex Labs is one that tests for this type of sensitivity, and it's one that we would recommend, and I'm sure Dr. Rose knows about those things too. But one thing I would recommend is to, if you were going to address a situation like this, or you were helping somebody who was doing that, I would recommend that rather than just going through a massive life change, get the test and find out what your baseline is. Guess where you, right now at the beginning, find out where you stand. And the reason it's a benefit is because, say you start feeling better in 3 or 4 weeks. I see this happening with my friends all the time. I'm feeling better, so I'm going to have those gluten pancakes when I go out for breakfast. I'm going to have that French toast that looked so damn good before. I'm going to have those things because I don't have that symptom anymore. I'm better. I went on a 3-week thing, and now I'm fine. But the general doesn't go away, and it's important to remember that. The general's on guard, and he's not going to go away. And as long as he's there and he's responding, you're going to have a reaction. So, am I way over? Oh, no. I'm over. I'm done. Thank you.